I wanted to preface this video with a warning to viewers who are easily squirmish or offended. This video is going to highlight many aspects of these games that are gory, queasy, and sometimes hard to follow. If you're uncomfortable with any of these descriptors, good, because I am too. It's difficult to pinpoint whether The Evil Within is a good series, or if it's a bad series. Many of its flaws come from how the games were directed, flaws like storytelling and weak characters. I'm still unsure if the flaws outweigh the positives, or whether the game is even worth talking about. What I do know, though, is that there's too much gore, not enough substance.
I'm sure we'll know everything once we get there.
The Evil Within is a series developed by Tango Gameworks. It's first directed by Nabeli Ayari, and the second by John Johannes. The series' executive producer, Shinji Mikami, is well known as the father of the survival horror genre, having worked on games such as Killer 7, Devil May Cry, Dino Crisis, and, of course, Resident Evil. In interviews featuring Shinji Mikami, it's clear to see that his main goal for this game was never meant to be pure horror. It was supposed to be a hybrid of horror and action, him stating his inspiration for this game series being Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Jaws, and Alien. Movies with horror aspects, some with action-packed scenes. I wanted to mention these inspirations because in most reviews I've seen regarding this series, it's treated as a survival horror, when it really should be treated as an action horror. I know there are trailers and sneak peeks that show The Evil Within as just a horror game, but most of the time these trailers are produced by an outsider team, one that usually doesn't have the executive producer's main goals in mind when creating these teasers. I'm going to be treating these games as an action horror rather than a survival horror from here on out. The first game is often considered to be the spiritual successor of Resident Evil 4. It's no coincidence that Mikami is known for this game in particular, being the last Resident Evil game he's worked on. Though it can be considered a spiritual successor, it doesn't play like one. The game mechanics are different enough to not mistake it for a copycat. Resident Evil 4 is known for its gun-ho attitude. You can jump right into the game and plow down enemies with your gun easily, whereas The Evil Within is slow-paced. Oftentimes it's much easier to sneak attack an enemy rather than shoot one. Resident Evil 4 is also known for its button masher cutscenes, infamous as they may be, and although The Evil Within has its button smashers, it's always with a crank or a doorway. The Evil Within 2 mechanically is very much the same. You have your guns and your sneak attacks, but what's different is the level of openness this game gives you. If you want to progress with the story in a linear fashion, you very much can, but you can also explore the many islands Detective Castellanos is placed on. Not only is there non-linear parts of the game, there's also a subsection area that, for the most part, is used mainly to get around the islands easier, as well as to introduce more story. To make this video easier to follow for myself, I'm going to be using a list of topics from the game to further demonstrate how, okay these games are. From here on out, there will be massive spoilers. You have been warned. Without going into obscene detail, both follow Detective Castellanos going through projected dreamlike sequences from inside of a system called STEM. It may sound complex, but when you boil it down to the core idea, the first story is about a middle-aged detective who's literally been placed into a hellish nightmare and must escape, and the second is him willingly re-entering the hellish nightmare to save his daughter, who was supposedly killed in a house fire. Both of these stories sound pretty cool, actually, but execution is everything. The first Evil Within starts with Castellanos being driven to Beacon Hospital with his partners Julie Kidman and Joseph Oda. As the cop driving, Oster Connolly, explains that a massacre has occurred at the hospital. A loud, piercing whistle emits through the radio and everyone in the police car is violently affected, save for Kidman. Connelly almost crashes the car, but gains control as the whistle stops. At this point, all characters have entered STEM. They arrive at the hospital and the game begins. The second game starts with Castellanos reliving the memory of him failing to rescue his daughter from the fire. We retrack the detective's footprints through the house as the building burns down. Castellanos finally reaches Lily's room and grasps her in his arms as she cries to him about how he didn't save her. It's at this point we realize we're in a dream, as Lily's skin starts to melt away, fire engulfing both hers and Castellanos' figure. But that's not the end of the scene. Castellanos wakes up in a bar, realizes Kidman is sitting across him. He gets hostile as Kidman explains his daughter is alive and that Mobius is for STEM. Castellanos knocks out 2 of Julie's Mobius guards but is rendered unconscious by Kidman herself. He wakes up and is wheelchaired into the new and improved STEM room as the Mobius administrator and Julie explain the situation within STEM. Sebastian finally realizes that he may get his child back and cooperates with Mobius by willingly re-entering STEM to recover Lily. You may think this is done, but nope, we still have a bit more to go. Castellanos literally falls back into STEM as he free falls into a black void. The opening cutscenes whiz by and he manages to land on his feet in what looks like an empty void, nothing like how STEM was in the first game. Now the game officially begins. You may have realized a big difference between the 2 games already. The second one takes too long to get into the game, establishes a story in a way that most reviewers huff about, telling us what's happening, not showing us. The beginning of the second game has us running through Castellanos' memory of what occurs on the day his daughter died, something I actually like. But it all goes downhill as soon as the nightmare sequence is over. He wakes up in a bar and Julie Kidman is just sitting there, as if she's been waiting for his dream to finish so she can start her plot exposition about how he needs to save Lily, how Mobius needs his help. The giant glaring problem with this opening is that Mobius is never strictly talked about during the main storyline of the first game. It's only alluded to during certain cutscenes between Dr. Jimenez and Ruben Victoriano. It's an important part of the story, but it's never explored further than flashbacks and objects in the game. This big baddie the second game establishes in the opening was only ever explained thoroughly in the first game's DLC. Meaning, if you want to understand why this game is suddenly about a corrupt secret corporation hell-bent on taking over humanity through STEM, you're going to have to buy the optional Julie Kidman DLCs, from which there are 2, The Assignment and The Consequence. This is why I feel the second game has already set itself up for failure. The first game, though, does a better job at establishing what the game will be about. 2 detectives and a rookie are sent to investigate the massacre that is happening at Beacon Hospital. The mysterious aspect of the game is shown with the sudden blaring whistle throughout that comes through the radio. We don't yet understand what this whistle has done or why it happened, raising the player's intrigue for what's to come. We understand the character dynamic between the cast. Sebastian talks to Joseph on a first-name basis, showing that the 2 know each other well and are comfortable with talking to each other informally, whereas Sebastian is more formal with Kidman, referring to her as Junior Detective Julie Kidman, her full name and title being used rather than just her name. The 2, or at least Sebastian, isn't comfortable enough to refer to each other by just a first-name basis. This is further proven by how Castellanos writes about the 2 colleagues in his diary. He refers to Joseph as a close friend, whereas Julie is the outsider, not to be trusted. The first one, though, isn't without its flaws. The story at times can be very convoluted and almost too hard to follow. The player may feel like they're playing a random nightmare simulator where Castellanos is randomly picked up and placed in different sequences and scenes, not quite fitting in. And although this was definitely intentional, it doesn't detract from the fact that it makes the player feel out of place. What I mean by Sebastian feeling out of place being intentional is that he isn't the center of the story. In fact, he isn't even a major player in the story's events. Much unlike the second game, which mostly focuses on Sebastian finding Lily, this game is about a mentally corrupt young adult named Ruben Victoriano. The story about a mentally disturbed young child who swore revenge on the folks who he believed to be people who almost murdered him and who murdered his sister, Laura Victoriano. His parents decide to lock him away in a basement in fear of the public seeing their disfigured child and thinking less of them. Ruben continued to conduct experiments on people and animals, eventually gaining enough money from Beacon Mental Hospital to create the prototype for STEM, which he made in order to finally be with his sister again. Eventually, Dr. Jimenez found out of his true intentions and, along with a group of Mobius agents, were sent to execute Ruben, and using his brain as the permanent host for his STEM prototype. This is when the actual story happens. Now that Ruben has full control over STEM, he uses it to send out a beacon throughout Crimson City, pulling in hundreds, if not thousands, of people from the city in hopes of finding a new host to leave STEM. This is why Sebastian is sent into STEM. Not because he was chosen, but because of cruel fate and him being at the wrong place at the wrong time. Ruben decides that a mentally unstable, fragile patient from Beacon Mental Hospital, Leslie Withers, is the perfect host, and uses his powers from within STEM to pull Leslie to himself. He ultimately succeeds as Julie and Sebastian fail in keeping Leslie safe, and Ruben's consciousness takes over Leslie's body. Sebastian wakes up to Julie saving him from Mobius employees taking his body for further testing, and falls in and out of the keep consciousness. After hours of this, he finally wakes up to find that Leslie is no longer inside of his STEM bathtub. He finally leaves Beacon Mental Hospital alone, Julie and Oda nowhere to be found, as he watches what he thinks is Leslie walk away from the crime scene. The second game plays out differently. Sebastian matters. He was chosen. Prior to the events of The Evil Within 2, Myra Hansen, Castellanos' estranged wife, disappears and joins Mobius after finding out that Mobius has Lily, her daughter. She hatches a plan with Julie Kidman as Esmeralda Torres and Theodore Wallace to become the new STEM host, destroying the new STEM in the process, and saving Lily while ultimately sacrificing her own life. This plan goes haywire as Myra and Theodore find Lily within STEM. Theodore betrays and threatens to kill Myra if she doesn't give him Lily, who he thinks has ultimate power to which he can possess. This causes Myra's mind to go corrupt, turning into a monster hell-bent on keeping her daughter safe. Somewhere in between Myra and Theodore finding a Lily and Sebastian entering STEM is when the story happens. Sebastian tries and fails to save Lily, running into a man called Stefano Valentini, a serial killer from the real world hired to capture Lily by Theodore. He goes rogue and takes Lily for himself, leading to the fall of Union, the fictional city within STEM housing the victims that Mobius has captured and placed within as test subjects. Stefano is killed by Sebastian in front of Lily, and she runs to Myra, who threatens to murder Sebastian if he gets in her way. Sebastian is knocked unconscious and wakes up in a dungeon. He runs into Theodore, who's created a cult from within STEM, and uses Sebastian's pasademons from the first game to scare him into joining his side, to kill Myra, and to take Lily to Theodore. Sebastian sees through this and is literally washed out by Theodore, sending him to a whole other part of Union entirely. This place is when Sebastian meets up with Torres, who tells him the plan that Myra had in saving Lily. Castellanos tells her the plan has been compromised by Theodore and that Myra is now been corrupt and is hostile to anyone that she deems a threat to Lily's safety. Somewhere between after Sebastian first encounters Myra and him finding out about the plan, Myra loses Lily. Sebastian and Torres confront Theodore, but since Theodore has some control in Union, he creates a hallucination that confuses Sebastian and causes him to fatally shoot Torres in the abdomen, losing consciousness in the process. Torres' last decision is to save Sebastian from the swarming enemies and sacrifices her life. This is when we learn why Torres was so adamant on saving Lily. She was the Mobius agent tasked with setting Sebastian's house on fire, faking the death of Lily Castellanos, and stealing Lily from her home. Sebastian realizes that Torres is not to blame, that Mobius is, and sets out to save Lily once and for all. Theodore once again uses Sebastian's trauma against him, but fails as he overcomes his past trauma and runs away, unintentionally running into Myra. She pierces his chest, presumably killing him. Myra, now docile to Sebastian, believes Lily to finally be safe within STEM. She appears to agree with Sebastian's plans on leaving STEM with him and Lily, but is impaled in the neck by Theodore. This causes Myra to go hostile again, using her powers to create an artificial sharpened cone around her arm, and thrusts into Theodore's head, killing him almost instantly. Myra retreats and Sebastian follows her to a replication of their older home, where he goes face to face with Myra's final corrupt form, the Matriarch. After Sebastian defeats her, she is finally cured from her corruption, but is wounded and pleads for Sebastian to save Lily and to leave STEM. This is when the story splits into two parts, one being Julie's part of the plan, the other being Sebastian rescuing Lily and leaving STEM. The administrator, along with the rest of Mobius's work, are murdered by chips in their brain as Julius fulfills her side of the plan. Cool. Sebastian and Lily finally leave STEM, as Union finally crumbles to nothingness, leaving a sad and lonely Myra. As he falls out of his bathtub, Sebastian crawls to Lily and pries open the doorway to reveal Lily, who's been submerged in psychoplasm. He catches his daughter, and the three silently leave the Mobius headquarters, Sebastian and Julie parting ways in the end. The second game suffers from way too many things happening at once. There's 4 main antagonists, Stefano, Theodore, the administrator, and Myra. There's 2 main story plots, one that follows Sebastian and one that follows Julie. Not only are there 2 story plots, but there's 3 subplots as well. There's one where Sebastian conquers his past trauma and metaphorically kills his past self as a way to finally move on with his life. There's one that involves a Mobius technician called Julian Sykes, who asks you to go deep into the marrow to find an alternative way out of Mobius. And there's one that revolves around a collectible you find throughout the game, where you and Kidman talk about subjects that have to do with the pictures in the collectible. The game is also now a non-linear exploration game where you have 2 to 3 large islands with many, many things to find. Let me tell you that collectibles are okay. I actually liked how they hid the keys at Haven harder than the last game, and that the echoes add a layer of world building to an otherwise normal city. But there's a difference between adding things with substance and adding random quests like Skyrim and Fallout. The Evil Within 2 is not entirely non-linear in its exploring. You have many sequences that make you stick to a very linear path, mostly during story bursts. Because of this, these side quests feel shallow and are oftentimes boring. Finding a few scraps or ammo isn't fun enough to go out of my way to traverse through a big island filled with enemies that could easily swarm and kill you. Now, I'm not saying the sub-stories aren't interesting. The trauma one in particular is actually quite good. You have Sebastian dealing with his demons he's faced due to the first game, plus his trauma with losing his wife and supposedly his daughter. The enemy you face through this part of the game, is legitimately creepy. The anima roams the room in search for you. She's a one-hit kill and is invincible. She actually looks quite similar to Laura Reborn boss, and I don't think that's a coincidence. She even hums the Claire de Lune after all. Sykes, on the other hand, was kind of boring. He isn't interesting enough to warrant me wanting to help him if I were to ever replay this game. And the ending to his story is so annoyingly, intentionally depressing that it makes me want to slap my face every time I play through it. In the end, you and Sykes finally find another way to leave STEM without the help of Mobius extracting you. The problem with this, though, is that there's a 25% chance that you'll make it out of STEM. The other 75% chance is you just kinda disappearing. Let me repeat that. Only 25%, which means that it's highly likely that Sykes is dead. This is annoying and unnecessarily depressing. Why not give us hope that not everyone in STEM is doomed to die? Other than Sebastian and Lily, Sykes is the only other person who would possibly have made it out alive. There's even more survivors in the first game than there are in this one, and the first game has Sebastian losing in the end. Arguably, the second game is a good ending. The subplot that revolves around the optional picture you collectibles is also one that I like. In the first game, Julie and Sebastian had little screen time together, and even less time interacting. I feel the creators knew this and wanted to add a mini story between the two that strengthened their bond in the end. Oh, I guess it also confirms that Joseph is indeed alive at the end of the story. Julie didn't kill him, but I don't think that was necessarily surprising considering his story was left ambiguous and his body wasn't exactly left like Sebastian's and Dr. Jimenez's, was it? Ultimately, what brings the second game's story to be lesser than that of the first one's is its usage of DLC material as the main bad guy. Too many things happening in this game to point where half of it isn't worth the time or an effort, and a weak storyline that goes on for just too long, that feels like it's been written in by a B-list team of writers from a producer who really just doesn't know what he's doing with this series anymore. It's sad, really. I had high hopes for the second one, and had a better time playing it too. Which leads me to my second point, the gameplay. Now, the Evil Within series has always had its issues with gameplay, with many reviewers and players alike complaining that the game feels clunky to play, and I can't say I disagree. The first game is the worst of the two, of course, with gameplay mechanics bad enough to artificially inflate the difficulty of the game to high degrees on the normal difficulty. The first thing you'll notice when playing this game is how slow Sebastian walks. It's so annoying to be forced to walk around, and it happens a lot, specifically in the safe house, somewhere you frequent to upgrade your guns, health, stamina, and the amount of ammunition you can carry at a time. It gets annoying to have to slowly walk from a mirror to the upgrade chair, and then back to the mirror to leave. There's also a lot of unnecessary sequences in the safe house that add nothing to the story and just drag on for far too long, most of which have you walking as well. Sprinting at the beginning of the game is another hassle. Although I don't see it as annoying as many other reviewers do, it takes about 5 seconds for the sprint to run out though. If the player uses all of the sprint, Sebastian will keel over and do a 3-second cooldown, working as a penalization for the player for using the entire sprint bar. The upgrade for the sprint bar greatly improves the bar size and therefore makes it less likely for the player to penalize themselves by using the entire bar, though it's still likely. I recommend this upgrade being the first one you get, otherwise it's a bitch to get around. My main gripe with this bar is that it's too small. There's a hallway in the safe room that demonstrates how small and inefficient the sprint bar is. You can just barely make it through the whole hallway before the penalty animation takes effect, but just barely. Now imagine this hallway is 2 times longer than it is now and you get the issue. But my biggest problem isn't the sprinting or the walking. It's the shooting. The shooting itself isn't bad, no. There are weak spots for all of the enemies, and it's not very difficult to use most of the weapons, but the issue is that the aim is inaccurate. It's surprisingly inaccurate. You can fix this issue with an upgrade, but since the game itself has a trophy that you can get for never upgrading, it really shouldn't be this bad. You can be pointing straight at the enemy's head and end up hitting their chest or just above their head. If a game makes it easier to throw a bottle at an enemy's head more accurately than shooting an enemy, period, there's a problem. Thankfully, the game is a lot more fun to play while sneaking around, so I can't say that I didn't really notice the inaccuracy at first on my first few playthroughs. Suffice to say, the sneaking shouldn't be the only effective way to kill an enemy if Sebastian has a whole arsenal of weapons at his disposal. Now, speaking of weapons, there's more than just guns that Sebastian can use in his inventory. There's matches that you can drop on fallen enemies or bosses to cause fire damage. This type of damage is usually fatal. You can use matches to kill multiple enemies in quick succession, and it's particularly useful between the 2 boss fights with Laura Reborn. There's bottles, an item that is mostly used to confuse the enemy, allowing for you to run to safety. It can also be used to stun the enemy, where you can then either do another sneak attack or, once again, run to safety. There's also a special weapon called a bomb. Its only usage being to either stun or explode an enemy. This weapon is usually harder to get and it's mostly useful to the special masked haunted with the guns. But let's not forget the most valuable weapon, the torch. It's basically an easy to use match. The only difference is that it's a lot less likely to get multiple enemies, though it's still likely. There's an eye up top of the screen that tells you whether the enemy has spotted you or if they're nowhere near. There isn't really an in-between, and the eye usually doesn't help gauge where the enemy is. There is a certain portion of the game where the eye is automatically open, most notably at the end of the game, where you go through a gauntlet of enemies to finally go one-on-one with Ruvik. In this portion of the game, it's impossible to hide yourself, as they will always know where you are. Moving on, I feel there's one too many collectibles. Literally. The map fragments don't feel important, whereas the newspapers, missing person posters, and documents strewn about the game and safe room are used to point the player in the right direction with the story, and paint Beacon Mental Hospital as a corrupt hospital, and that uses its patients as guinea pigs. All the map's fragments do is show a dated-looking map of Crimson City, something that isn't really important, as we aren't within Crimson City, we're in STEM. Let's not forget arguably the most important collectible, the statues. Throughout the game are statues that hide keys from within itself, that open up lockers inside of the safe room. Inside these lockers are consumables such as green gel, ammunition, or health packs. These keys are particularly useful as the game is often sparse of consumables, but it isn't without its issues. They often look out of place, specifically through the later portion of the game. It goes from Victorian age villages to rustic, disgusting factories. The placement of the statues are often lazy, most notably being a statue on a bird that flies out of a lock and then flies in a circle until you shoot the statue off. Despite that, I feel it's the most important optional collective that rewards the player for finding it better than the rest. The green gel is the game's currency with upgrading Sebastian and his weapons. You mostly obtain green gel through finding it in jars strewn about the maps or as rewards for killing a difficult enemy or boss. You can also obtain a small amount of gel from murdered fallen, but it seems to matter how you kill the fallen. What I noticed is I usually get more gel from sneak attacking an enemy than I do with going in gun blazing, leading me to believe that this was intentional. You can use gel to upgrade Sebastian's stamina, health, gun accuracy, and how much ammunition he can carry, and how much damage the gun can do, of course. The most notable upgrade, in my opinion, is the upgrade you have to get for the gun to do critical damage. This is the one upgrade, along with the stamina bar upgrade, that I recommend getting, as if you don't get this upgrade for your weapons, they will never do a critical hit that instantly kills the enemy. Even if you're aiming and you shoot the head, that doesn't mean that they will die automatically. Once you're done upgrading Sebastian to his fullest degree, green gels are effectively useless. There's no reason to pick it up, and you can't use it to buy any consumables. This is an issue that plagues both games, but it's such a menial one that there's really nothing to fuss about. The game also caps you at exactly 99,999,999 gels, but I'd imagine that it's pretty hard to get there. And by then, why would you? There's the consumables, such as ammunition and health packs. You find them throughout the game and with the lockers in your safe house. But there's also a really annoying health pack that penalizes the player for using it, which I don't understand. Why would a health pack penalize the player? Why did you do this, Bethesda? Alright, there's also the option to punch in this game, but it does so little damage that its only real use is for when you don't want to waste your ammo with breaking open boxes. It's not important. The gameplay for the first game is clunky enough to make the decent story that goes with this game nil. Zip, zilch, nada, not good enough. It's hard to get into a game with gameplay as bad as this one. It's a shame, given how the story is something I actually like despite its flaws. There are times in this game that I feel like my death isn't my own fault. If a game does that to you, it's not a good game. No game should have issues that actually make it annoying to play. I feel like I'd like the game much better if I had just watched a YouTuber play it. That's how bad the gameplay feels. Moving Sebastian around feels like you're fighting with the game itself. There are times that I've died from traps because Sebastian wouldn't stop. The latency issue with moving is such a big issue. It's crazy they decided to actually allow that to be kept in the game. It's absurd. Let's not forget about the letterboxing. That thing that's mostly used in movies to create better watchability, sometimes allowing for things to be hidden behind it. They work for film and videos because we're not interacting with them in any way that would make these things annoying. When you add unneeded letterboxes to video games, though, that's when they get annoying. You have these two large black rectangular boxes above and below the player that hinders what they can see on the screen at any given time. Of course, these letterboxes became optional after an update with the game, but it's still a default setting which tells us that this is how the game is meant to be played. Now, I have to give credit where it's due for The Evil Within 2. It's loads better than the first gameplay-wise. They obviously took the first game's gameplay criticism to heart and created a better experience, one that's actually fun to play. But with that, they also created more issues, one that I'm going to let out off the bat, because most of the game's mechanics are just a better version of the previous. They made the game a bit too easy. Now, the first game wasn't exactly hard, but you can't say it wasn't easy either. It hid consumables well, the gel was a bit harder to get, and there wasn't more land to explore. The second game dumbs down the difficulty enough to where I never had an issue with defeating the enemies. I never ran out of ammunition for the weapons I was using, and most importantly, they added a crafting mechanic. One that was strictly used for the crossbow of the first game has now been upgraded. You can now create ammunition whenever you want. All you have to do is find the scrap. I would have been fine with the crafting mechanic had they not added the ammunition. The first game having scarce ammunition was part of the point. It made the player think a second before using up their ammunition for a certain gun. The second one kind of throws that out of the window with this mechanic, by allowing the player to create their own ammunition whenever you get rid of that difficulty aspect of the game. But this mechanic doesn't even really matter because they littered the map with plentiful amounts of ammunition and health items. I never ran out of ammo, I never ran out of health items, I never felt like I had to preserve ammunition because I had a backup crafting mechanic I could use whenever, so long as I had extra scrap. This is on normal. They made the game feel so easy on normal. But that's only a few parts of the mechanics in this game that just don't feel right to me. And I can't say that I didn't have a funner experience with this game than the first one. The movement feels a lot smoother than the first one. He doesn't walk as slowly, nor does his stamina bar feel smaller than it should be. Sebastian doesn't feel like a goddamn truck anymore. He stops and actually stops where you want him to. The guns are accurate in this game, even without upgrading it. I never got the inclination that my gun wasn't intentionally shooting at the wrong area. The sneaking mechanic has been greatly improved. Now you can hide inside of bushes and legitimately behind covers, something that was included in the Kidman DLC but not in the main game. The match and grenade weapons have gone unused, but it makes sense for the match at least. The grenade never really worked too well, and was a hard to obtain weapon in the first place, so I never really cared for its disappearance. Now included in an extra weapons is the knife, and different versions of the same gun, such as shotguns with 4 barrels that take up more ammunition, or a sawed-off shotgun that does more damage up close, for example. Optional collectibles stay pretty much the same, though they did get rid of the Crimson City pieces and added echoes to the mix. Echoes are a way to look into the lives of Union citizens and Mobius workers prior to the events of The Evil Within 2. They're based on the flashback sequences of the first game, but are used more often and aren't really important to the story, save for 3 that are located at the end. There's another even harder to find optional collectible that's more of a way to cameo things that came from Bethesda's past games. It's boring but cute, and there aren't many in the game, so it's not worth mentioning. Like the first game, green gel is used as a currency to upgrade Sebastian and his weapons. There's more to do in the safe room this time, with an optional minigame that Tatiana hosts and a side story involving Sebastian and Julie. There's also now a coffee machine that fills Sebastian up to full health inside most of the Union safe rooms. It's not really useful unless you're on low health and don't mind sprinting to the nearest safe house. I'm not really sure why they added this into the game, and it doesn't really make sense compared to what Sebastian usually uses to heal himself. He uses syringes and first aid medkits. Why would coffee be the most efficient heal? Speaking of medkits, they don't hinder the player for a few seconds, something that many people were annoyed with in the first game, so props to you guys for listening to the fans. Speaking of hindering the fans, of course, they've now added a new gel, called the red gel. The red gel functions as a blockage to the players from upgrading Sebastian to his best abilities too early on. It's extremely rare and is mostly used as a prize of the player for beating a boss or furthering the plot progression. It may hinder the player, but it makes sense to do so if it harms the player's overall gameplay. You don't want your player being maxed out on your upgrades partway through the game. Almost all of these things create a better gameplay experience. It's no wonder people prefer this game over the first. It's not hard to say that when going into these 2 games with the gameplay in mind, the second one definitely wins. But the problem still stands. The island should have been a bit more linear. There's no reason to have made this game a pseudo-open world experience when no real substance comes out of it other than a few decent side stories. I'm bringing this up because it truly hinders my experience, and from me recommending this game to anyone who likes both horror and action. If you play it linear, you get a better experience out of it. I don't know why they did this. The first game fails in gameplay due to its clunky mechanics, leading to many reviewers, much like myself, to find the game almost difficult to play. The game inflates its difficulty by creating fake difficulty spikes, such as guns that don't do enough damage, a stamina bar that penalizes you for using it completely, and an intentionally inaccurate gun aim. Now, let's get onto the meaty part of the video. The characters. Of course, we're going to have to talk about Sebastian Castellanos, the main character of both games and the one we play as. He's a resilient, headstrong Crimson detective, one that's had to deal with the death of his daughter, Lily Castellanos, and the disappearance of his wife and fellow detective, Myra Hansen. During the first game, he keeps his emotion mostly in check. We only ever see his emotions slip when he's confronting either Julie or Ruvik. where we get to see his more angry and demanding side. We see his compassion and worry for others when he vows to protect Leslie from Kidman. He's strong but now without his weaknesses. When suddenly losing both his wife and daughter, he spiraled into a depressive state, one that he's still dealing with. He takes to drinking his emotions away and becomes abusive and crass with people he deals with in his line of work. He almost loses his job, but is saved by Joseph Oda, his partner and closest confidant. His relationship with Oda is extremely close, so close that when Oda loses his glasses, Sebastian risks his life to get them. He saves Joseph from ending his own life and comforts him when Oda feels like he's losing his mind at the church. An issue that many fans and I have with his character is that he himself wasn't very fleshed out. He plays his part as a stoic detective throughout the first game and just barely starts to grow as a person in the second. We understand his dynamic with other characters, but we don't understand him. There are moments in the first and second game where it's clear that if he sets his mind on something, it's hard for him to sway from it. Like how he truly felt there was something fishy with Kidman. But in the second game, he so quickly forgives Torres from being the person to set his house on fire and to steal his child. Sebastian understands that in the end, Mobius is the reason why Lily was ultimately taken. But that doesn't change the fact that Torres' actions basically ruined his life. He believed his child had died. His wife left to search for a mysterious group of people she believed to be the reason for their child's death and subsequently disappeared. And he almost lost his job, his last leg into reality. Sebastian holding on to a grudge for Julie makes sense. Yes, because he believes she's the reason Joseph is dead. But why does he so easily forgive Torres? They're both employed by the same company and were both tasked with doing something he felt was unjust and evil. This is my main gripe with him. He can be pretty boring too, and his actions sometimes don't correlate with what he says. Also, his actor for the first and second game were iffy at best, though the second one definitely does better. Julie Kidman is Sebastian's junior detective teammate and is also a spy for Mobius, tasked to keep watch on Sebastian's snooping. She was once a criminal who would occasionally do petty theft in order to survive, having left home at a young age due to her parents being abusive. She was taken in by Mobius and subsequently brainwashed into following their orders, becoming a quiet, mysterious figure in the game. From the get-go, it's obvious that neither Sebastian nor Joseph really trust her, or even really like her. She is used as backup, left outside the scene of the crime. Throughout the first game, the main storyline, she is frequently missing. Her story has to do with capturing and making sure Leslie Withers is safe. We're led to believe that Mobius is planning on using Withers' unconsciousness as a host for their new stem, and Julie is tasked with securing Leslie and making sure that Ruvik doesn't get him. Throughout the DLC, we learn that her childhood was less than ideal, something that the administrator uses against her on multiple occasions. Because she's been brainwashed by Mobius's every beck and call, her personality doesn't shine until the second game. Since she's had a history with not following authority, even the brainwashing that Mobius uses doesn't work. She goes against her orders throughout STEM, going completely against her main objective to keep Leslie safe, by planning on killing him. Despite her main goal in the story being to kill Leslie, she feels remorse for what she has to do. Kidman comforts Leslie, taking him to a playground with a calming aura and promises to keep him safe. She fails in her own goals and feels personally responsible for allowing Ruvik to escape. Her character's personality changes during the second game. Instead of being a quiet and mysterious figure, she's brass and a lot more sympathetic to Sebastian. She meets Myra Hansen, Sebastian's estranged wife, and hatches a plan with her to save Lily. Myra and Julie's relationship isn't fully explored, but it's assumed that since Julie met and fought with Sebastian inside of STEM, Myra felt she was trustworthy enough to keep her plan a secret, and enough for Julie to play a pivotal role in the plan, being the person who makes Myra the host of STEM, allowing Lily to be freed. Her and Sebastian gain trust in each other throughout the side story involving the collectible pictures found out throughout the game. At first, Sebastian is untrustworthy of Julie, and for just reason. But after he realizes she's on his side, he begins to wind down and stops being as aggressive to her. She's without a doubt one of the best characters in the series. Her character doesn't have many holes in her personality. The change from her in the first game and her in the second game makes sense. She's met and partnered up with Myra, so it makes sense for Julie to be sympathetic and to want to work alongside Sebastian. She's always been untrusting of authority and has a moral compass to protect humanity from Mobius, as she's worked alongside this company and realizes its rising power. The problem with Julie, though, is how she treated Joseph. We know he isn't dead, we know that Julie has information regarding where he is exactly, but what doesn't make sense is why she doesn't sound all that interested. Her actions throughout the game show she has sympathy for the victims of STEM and Mobius, as she's involved in a plan that will eventually get rid of both, but Joseph doesn't seem to fit in the category for her. It's possible she felt he was a threat to her safety, but that doesn't change the fact that she is responsible for what happened to him. The actions of hers goes completely against what she stands for now, but it's only one issue, and I feel like Joseph's situation will definitely be solved in either a DLC or a third installation of the game. Let's head on to Joseph Oda. He's the brains to Sebastian's brawn, an observant detective, one who knows what to ask but can be easily overpowered. For the majority of the game, Oda is at Sebastian's side, helping him with killing any haunted that may harm him. He's a sympathetic character. Throughout the game, he's plagued with the possibility of turning into a haunted himself. His actions as a pre-haunted aren't that of his own and often make him feel an immense amount of guilt, leading into a depressive state. There are multiple occasions where he almost kills his teammates Sebastian and Julie, in fear that he may turn completely. This leads to his suicidal tendencies during the first game, even at one point stealing Sebastian's gun and pointing it at his temple. We are never really given much screen time with him, but with what little we do, it's very clear that he cares for his friends and colleagues, even going out of his way to tell his chief of the Crimson Police Department of Sebastian's alcoholic addiction. He runs into Julie's line of fire to try and save Leslie from her, and even risks his own life by running straight into a trap because of his worry for Julie's safety. The one gripe with his character, though, is how he doesn't play much of an important role in the Book of the Evil Within artwork. It's stated he was meant to die halfway through the game, and it shows. Halfway through the game is when he stops being prevalent or important. Hell, there's even one sequence where he straight up becomes a hinder to the game's progression. As sad as it sounds, I feel they should have stuck to their original plans of him dying halfway through, instead of stretching his life out for a possibility of him having a DLC revolving around him. It's a shame, really. I really wanted to like him. He's really cool, and his voice actor is amazing. But he just doesn't have enough to do. It would have made more sense to Joseph to have died. He's a sympathetic victim of Rubik's, and having him turn completely into a haunted, it being his main fears throughout the game, and having him die by the hands of Sebastian would have been great story-wise. It would have given Sebastian even more reason to hate Ruvik, and would boost him into wanting to gain justice for his fallen comrade by killing the enemy. Would have also made the ending even more depressing, given that Sebastian fails. But that's just my thoughts. Leslie Withers is a major plot piece, not a character. He's an emotionally, mentally, and physically abused Beacon Mental Hospital patient whose body Ruvik takes over at the very end of the game. He's mainly used as a MacGuffin. We don't really understand why his brainwaves match with that of Ruvik's, other than it maybe having to do with the trauma he had to deal with. There are times where Withers will scream out what's about to happen or the dangers that will occur. We're not given an explanation as to why he knows this information other than he's just kinda creepy. Hell, even some of the writers have stated Leslie is boring and a nuisance. They didn't flesh this character out at all. He doesn't do anything besides warn Sebastian about traps or enemies and then die at the end. Dr. Marcelo Jimenez is the doctor that took care of Leslie Withers and many of the other patients at the Beacon Mental Hospital. In actuality, he was a corrupt doctor who was being paid by Mobius to allow Ruvik to test experiments on his patients. One could argue that if it weren't for the doctor's actions revolving around Ruvik and his early alpha build of STEM, the actions of this game would not have occurred. He can be considered the third antagonist of the game, though throughout it, he's not a threat to Sebastian and at some points even helps him. He's never seen without his patient Leslie, and when he is, his only goal is to keep Leslie safe from Ruvik. At one point, the doctor even almost gets him and Sebastian out of STEM, but ultimately fails and is killed by the Amalgam Alpha, a representation of all the victims that Ruvik killed while testing STEM. He's a bad guy and doesn't really have much screen time, but with what the few we do have of him, it's clear that he understands what's going on, where he is, and how royally fucked he is if he doesn't escape. Throughout the game, we're shown flashbacks of him and Ruvik's interactions. It's clear at the beginning he treated young Ruvik as a child prodigy, having the hospital back Ruvik's testing. But when Ruvik's more sadistic sides take over, him and Marcelo no longer see eye to eye. He ultimately, along with Mobius agents, kill Ruvik and use his brain to test STEM. In the Kidman DLC, though, we find out that after the events that transpired with him and Ruvik, he was no longer used by Mobius, as they now had STEM and their host. He's used efficiently, and I quite like him. Tatiana Gutierrez is a nurse from Mental Beacon Hospital that is prominently found inside Sebastian's safe houses. She's stoic and doesn't really show her emotions throughout the first game. She teaches the player about upgrading and how to open the lockers, and that's really it. She gets a slightly bigger role in the second game, hosting a mini shooting game that's way too similar to the Resident Evil 4 version to be coincidence, and has a lot more personality. But that's it, really. At times during the second game, she could be snarky and humorous to Sebastian. She cares somewhat about him, but it's not clear what side she stands on. Tatiana gives Sebastian hints and let him vent his frustrations out to her, but other than that, she's not too important. And then there's Ruvik. He's the main antagonist of the first game, and he's very, very edgy. His main goal throughout the whole game is to leave STEM. From what little information were given of him, his sadistic personality was there from the get-go. As a child, he would dissect small animals and pigs, and as he got older, his fascination with dissecting only grew bigger, eventually culminating in him using human test subjects. His reasons for creating STEM come from his love for his deceased sister, Laura Victoriano. He wanted to create something that would allow him to once again be with his sister, that thing being STEM. This is because, as a child, Ruvik and Laura were caught in a barn fire. His family was notorious with the villagers in his town, and they wanted to get back at the family by destroying a part of their property. What the villagers didn't know was that Laura and Ruvik were in the barn at the time. They set fire, and Laura sacrifices her life to save her younger brother by pushing him out of the only window in the barn. Ruvik is left scarred and mentally damaged. His father decides to lock him in the basement in fear that his family's reputation will be harmed, and pronounces both his daughter and his son dead to the public and to his wife. Throughout this time in his life, he started making the alpha version of STEM. He gained the Beacon Mental Hospital's fundings at a young age, and Mobius's backings at some point as well. He was able to pay for STEM through these two fundings. Sometime between him starting the creation of STEM and his death, he killed his parents. This was one of the main reasons Mobius decided to get rid of Ruvik, the other being his plans to use STEM to get Laura back. Mobius and Dr. Jimenez kill Ruvik and set fire to the Victoriano mansion, blaming the fire for his death and his body's disappearance. They continue to do tests on Ruvik's alpha STEM and use his brain to power it. While this is all happening, Ruvik hatches up a plan to escape by emitting a frequency that makes people enter STEM without the need of the bathtubs. He gets his main target, Leslie Withers, and succeeds in taking over his mind and body. Ruvik successfully leaves STEM and walks away from Beacon Mental Hospital. Yeah, I'm not the only one in saying this, but Ruvik is way too edgy. I don't like him as an antagonist. I understand his motives, and I understand how he's able to succeed, but this bad guy is just way over the top. Keep in mind, he's not the worst bad guy. Compared to the other, he's probably the least annoying and most effective. His lack of appearance in the second game has me believing that the people who worked on the second game also believed Ruvik to be way too edgy, and for that, I say good. I have a feeling, though, that he's going to come back, either in a DLC or a sequel to the game. Hopefully, this sequel or DLC will mellow this character down a bit. Let's jump into the second game's characters. Lily Castellanos is the daughter of Myra and Sebastian Castellanos, and is difficult to describe. She has very little screen time, and the time that she does have is her either running away or unconscious. It's very clear that she was taken care of during her time at Mobius, as it doesn't look like she's been physically or mentally harmed, other than being told that her father had died in a house fire. We get a lot of dialogue from other characters stating how she's special, how she's unique compared to the other kids her age. She makes the perfect candidate for STEM host, as said by the administrator. It's the classic show, don't tell, and we're definitely not shown. Her character is genuinely uninteresting. It feels like the main goal for the first game was for us to believe she was actually killed in the fire and that Myra had something to do with it. Also, her actress was pretty bad. Actually, small tangent, most of the actors for this series is bad. Sebastian's actor sounds like he's so uninterested it's funny. Lily's character sounds way too mature for her age and it really just doesn't match her appearance at all. Leslie's voice actor is a hit or miss, with some of his dialogue being really bad. specifically the scenes where he has to scream. He is not a good screamer. You think they'd pay for really good actors given this game is backed by Bethesda. Okay, back onto the topic. Myra Hansen is a pretty weird character as well. I genuinely thought she would be the antagonist for this game, only for me to discover that she kinda wasn't. The first game had it seem like she was brainwashed by Mobius, similar to Julie Kidman, and I'm not the only one to notice this. She's a loving mother who will do anything in her power to save her child, and that means losing her husband and working for the enemy in the process. She's headstrong, but weak-willed, as shown with how easily she corrupts within STEM. This also shows how emotional she is, as STEM corrupts depending on how vulnerable the character is. I say if it were a pick between her or Joseph being the most vulnerable character, it'd have to be Myra. She had to deal with the loss of her child, her husband and job calling her insane for thinking there's a conspiracy that has to deal with her child's disappearance, and has to deal with the guilt of working alongside Mobius, being within grasp of her child, never having the ability to actually save her from this hellhole. I feel that explains why she's become a Lost, and later the matriarch. But I still can't get that taste out of my mouth that the first game had us thinking she would be the big baddie for the next game. It was so obvious. She was the woman who recruited Julie Kidman into Mobius. Her face is never shown in the first game, much like the administrators, and she doesn't show any emotion whatsoever, even when she's within inches from her husband's presumed corpse. Remember, this is before her and Julie hatched the plan to save Lily, so she doesn't know that Sebastian is alive yet. Either I can chalk it up to her being brainwashed, much like Julie, and having gotten out of it at a later date prior to The Evil Within 2, or the writers of the second game didn't really understand the first game's intentions with her and decided to scrap the idea for a more sympathetic approach. As for her plan, she should have done a bit more research as to who she confided in. Theodore had a cult following and had his own religion that she predominantly practiced and even made posters about. I'm not sure how she didn't find this out, as she was smart enough to find a way to get into STEM under Mobius's nose, but I digress. Theodore Wallace. Theodore Wallace. Arguably the least over-the-top antagonist save for Myra, and yet still so edgy. As the cult leader for his church called the Mew Center, it's quite surprising he somehow made it past Mobius's background check. Surely the Mew Center was documented at some point online, as it gained a generally high following. Hell, he even became a high-ranking member. How did Mobius let this happen? His character's usage of wording can be quite persuasive, but being persuasive surely can't be enough to walk his way into Mobius, right? Father Theodore Wallace is a manipulative, power-hungry man who decided to use Mobius and Myra to enter STEM and gain control through the inside by using Lily's power. He sees himself as a god to be worshipped and offers little remorse, killing anyone within Union who refuses to adhere to his will and bow down before him. He plans to use Mobius as a puppet, using Mobius's own plans of emitting a frequency much similar to that of the loud whistle in the first game, to make people enter STEM unwillingly and create a world that would see him as a god. His powers involve him creating a hallucination that can confuse Sebastian into thinking he's seeing something entirely different than what is actually happening. He's a ruthless killing machine and uses emotional manipulation to get rid of his foes. But he's not fleshed out, sorry. I can't understand his motives. I mean, he's a pretty unique antagonist, to be honest, but I'm not scared of him. His whole motif is that of the hellish flames and blood. He's the epitome of what the Evil Within's aesthetic is, and it's boring. If you were to get rid of him and replace him with Valentini, what difference would it make? They're both ruthless murderers whose true intentions aren't shown until it's too late. But then again, I could say the same thing for Stefano Valentini. He's the first antagonist who were ever shown in this game. He's the trailer boy, and his voice acting is so good to listen to. Stefano Valentini is a psychopathic, artistic serial killer who was stolen by Mobius to put a more artistic person within Union. This backfires since people with psychopathy can gain some control from within STEM, as they make for a suited host as well. He realizes what's going on and how his art can now be taken to a whole next level, and he runs with it, wreaking havoc from within Union. At some point prior to Sebastian entering Mobius' STEM, Theodore hires Stefano to find Lily for him, and at first he does so, but then realizes with Lily having full control as the host of STEM, he can use her as a way to use his powers within STEM limitlessly. He's capable of encasing his art pieces into a rectangular prism, one that repeats the gory death of the victim as a way to forever encapsulate his art, as stated by Stefano himself. Not only is he able to do that, but he's also capable of flash stepping, much similar to Ruvik in the first game. Unlike Ruvik, however, he mostly uses this power to escape his foes or get to a part of the Union Islands much easier. He's so over the top and flamboyant, though, that I can't really take this antagonist seriously. He's a fun antagonist, don't get me wrong, but it seems so out of character for this game. During the last half of his arc, he kills what appears to be the rest of the survivors in Union, a spectacularly disgusting scene where the bombs around their heads explode, leading to hundreds or so people in the room to simultaneously die. He then encases them all inside of the giant cube to preserve their deaths. This one scene shattered any actual level of disbelief in this game. The scene is so absurd it feels like it came out of a Saturday night cartoon featuring Bugs Bunny. How did they think this was a good scene? How did they think this was a good idea? This scene was so unnecessary. It didn't do anything but show how his character was a ruthless killing machine. Though we already know that with the debriefing we get from Julie Kidman and, oh, right, also the many art pieces strewn about throughout the game. Without this scene, I think I would have liked him a bit more than Ruvik. He isn't so incredibly edgy compared to Theodore in Ruvik, and he's got a buttery smooth voice that I could listen to for probably like 5 minutes without getting annoyed. Well, at least he wasn't as cartoonishly evil as the Administrator, and believe me, is he pretty cartoonish, the Administrator, who basically represents all of the worst aspects of Mobius, making his first appearance in the Julie Kidman 2 DLCs, The Assignment and The Consequence, playing as the main antagonist for both. He's the mysterious head of Mobius and is technically responsible for the events that occurred in the first and second game. His main goal is to take control of the whole of humanity, effectively getting rid of free will in a twisted effort to create what he feels to be a utopian world filled without war or famine. Though his goals appear to be well-intentioned, his actions throughout the series state otherwise. He believes almost all of his staff members are expendable and isn't afraid to kill in order to obtain what he feels is needed to fulfill his goal. He's shown to not bat an eye when sending out his Mobius agents to capture and murder Ruvik, as he feels it's a necessary evil to obtain STEM Alpha. His ruthless, almost cartoonish villainy matches that of a Batman antagonist, but he wasn't always so blatant with his evil plans. During the first game, his evil actions are hidden under a more professional businessman personality when recruiting Julie. His evil actions are exaggerated and manipulated by Ruvik himself, and since everything within STEM can be manipulated and altered by Ruvik, since he's the host, it's unsure if the depictions of the Administrator are exaggerated or are an accurate depiction of his true personality. Of course, everything that I've just said is all thrown out of the window, as in the second game, we almost immediately see that this character is so goddamn evil. He decides to say an evil monologue in front of a tied-up Sebastian at the beginning of the game. The once scary looming presence of this man in the first game is now replaced by a very brightly lit, very evil-looking Administrator, who thinks a goddamn monologue is more important than debriefing and strapping Sebastian into STEM. But don't worry, it gets worse. During the last few moments of the game, where Julie finally manages to fulfill her part of Myra's plan, we get the infamous scene where he taunts Julie from up above his survey room, telling her how he's going to love watching her being tormented, and how he's going to kill her slowly after her plan fails. This is when we finally get Mobius' true motives, as he states how Mobius is going to use STEM to take over everyone's minds and how he's going to control this world and make sure that it's a perfect utopia. This is also when we get the generic "there's a third option" by Julie Kidman, before the Administrator uses a fucking app on his phone to try to terminate Kidman by using the chip planted inside of all Mobius workers inside of her head. A fucking app on his phone. We learn that Kidman hacked her way into this app. I can't imagine it was hard, since it's a fucking phone app, and decided to terminate everyone else's chip from within their head. This includes the Administrator himself. The Administrator let a chip that could potentially kill him inside of his head. Why? Why did he let this chip get placed inside of his head? What was the point? Why would he let that even be a possibility? I thought that the chips were put into Mobius workers' heads as a threat that if they ever fucked up and compromised Mobius, they could die within seconds. Why would he even have to worry about that to his own goddamn self? He's the administrator of the operation. This plot point doesn't even make sense. The administrator is dumb. I hate him. Moving on. There's Esmeralda Torres, the Black Ops demolitionist tasked by Mobius in abducted Lily and setting fire to the Castellanos household. Feeling an immense amount of remorse for her actions, she decides to join up with Myra, Julie, and Theodore to save Lily from within STEM. Sebastian officially meets Torres halfway through the game, where she's been protecting him from the Lost and Spawn from within an abandoned shack. She's extremely strong and independent, capable of keeping herself relatively safe without Sebastian's help. Her appearance in this game is quite brief, and it's a shame, really. She is one of the few lively, optimistic characters in this series. It makes her feel out of place, like she was meant to be in a game like The Last of Us. She isn't without her weaknesses, though. She's solely responsible with what happened to Lily and her family and vows to make things right. Though this is stated by other characters, and even by herself through her diary entry, she herself never actually shows any remorse or even really mentions it to Sebastian. They never had a one-on-one scene where Torres is lambasted by Sebastian for stealing his daughter, and they never make up and move on with the plan. My biggest issue with Torres is how weird other characters treat her, specifically Sebastian and Myra. Why would they so easily forgive her? I mean, I understand she isn't entirely to blame, but like I said in Sebastian's section, she's still partially to blame. She did, in fact, steal Lily from the Castellanos family, leaving her to be presumed dead. Other than this, there is no real character progression, but I feel like she doesn't really need one. She appears so late in the game that it's quite hard to find a reason for her existence other than for her to be the character to sacrifice herself in the end, saving Sebastian even though he wounded her by a gunshot in the abdomen. You could actually say this is what she gets, being unintentionally killed by the man whose life you ruined by just doing your job. Other than those issues, I feel she's an okay character, albeit oddly placed within this game. Then there's Yukiko Hoffman, the team psychologist. She's the main reason why most of the Union citizens are inside STEM in the first place, and is also responsible for allowing Stefano Valentini and Theodore Wallace to both enter Union and work at Mobius. Her main task is to test people whether they are worth putting into Union or whether they can work for Mobius, and she's kind of bad at both, not gonna lie. She is calm and analytical, but sympathetic to a point. She realizes ultimately it's her fault that the denizens of Union all died at the hands of the psychotic few that made it past her test, and feels her only way of redemption is to help Sebastian get Lily out of STEM. She tragically dies after being tackled by a Lost and becomes engulfed in Theodore's flames. She's kind of boring, but endearing. I like the scenes she has with Sebastian. There isn't too much going on with her character, and you could definitely feel her expendability from the get-go. Other than that, I don't really have much going on against her character other than her death scene, which could have so obviously been avoided had Sebastian not forgotten about his weapons, but she's an okay character. She plays her part. There's Liam O'Neill. Liam is the first survivor that Sebastian finds within STEM. He's a cowardly technician sent in to find Lily alongside the rest of his team, but got separated and becomes the last of his team to survive. His viewpoints show him to be less sympathetic to the Union citizens, feeling his life to be far more important than the people who lived within STEM. He rejects leaving his safe house, but gives Sebastian an extra walkie-talkie from which Liam O'Neill helps point him to the right direction. Halfway through the game, he's abducted and brainwashed by Theodore into becoming a follower of his cult and is corrupted. He turns into a harbinger and is tasked with killing Sebastian. Ultimately, after Sebastian defeats O'Neill, he briefly regains consciousness and thanks Sebastian for ending his life before he can do more harm. Despite being a coward and thinking of himself with higher regards, he's not exactly heartless. He asks Sebastian to find out what happens to the rest of his team. You find echoes of his past teammates who were planning on murdering the rest of Union citizens before they had the chance to turn into Lost, but are killed off one by one, mostly by each other and one by the hands of Stefano. If you take this information to O'Neill, he thanks you for your time and is obviously shocked and saddened to hear he's the last of his original teammates. And finally, there's Julian Goddamn Sykes. Julian is a friendly technician who's become trapped within STEM, much unlike O'Neill, and is trying to find a way out before the entirety of Union collapses. Sebastian finds Sykes atop a truck calling out for help as he's swarmed by countless Lost. He helps Sykes and is taken to his safe house, where Sykes debriefs Sebastian on his plans to escape STEM without the help of Mobius. We learn that Julian doesn't really think highly of Mobius, and only works because it pays well and gives him an easy recognition for better jobs in the future. He tasks Sebastian in entering the mirror to turn on a console that allows him to search through the STEM code to see if there's another way out. Eventually, Sykes manages to find a possible exit and once again tasks Sebastian to re-enter Mirror to clear out the area for his safety. Sebastian and Sykes bid farewell as he enters a STEM bathtub and disappears. After this, we learn of the 25% chance that Sykes has of surviving, and I promptly roll my eyes out of my eye sockets as nothing in this game can ever have a happy ending. Of course, the player has initiative to do these side quests for Sykes, as this leads to the player of having the ability to open the orange Mobius boxes strewn about the Union Islands, most of which are filled with scrap, healing items, ammo, and the occasional new weapon. Sykes himself isn't really special, but it's refreshing to meet a character that doesn't threaten or is wary of Sebastian and is instead friendly, much like Torres. Sykes is possibly the first survivor of the second STEM disaster. That is, of course, if he took his chip out of his head in time, but it's unlikely he survived either, given he's never informed of Myra's plans to destruct the chip within STEM workers. Rest in peace, bud. And that is all. Out of all the characters in the series, there's a total of 4 good ones, out of a plethora of bad, boring, and downright stupid characters. It's obvious the characters were never the strong suit of the series, and no one ever stated it were. I want to make it clear that both games fail in the character aspect, though if you count how many I actually feel as decent being a positive, you could say that The Evil Within 2 wins by 1 extra character. You go, Yukiko. After playing well over 50 plus hours into these games combined and even more into writing the script, I can say with full certainty that yes, these games are really, really okay. They're not unique in any way. You can play different games and gain better experience with them. You want a better linear story? Go play Resident Evil 4. If you want a somewhat non-linear explorative game but with linear aspects to it, play Uncharted 4. That game's got even better characters. If you want a fun action-packed shooting experience, play any of the Halo games. If you want a good horror experience, play Silent Hill 2. Any and all of these games give you a better experience than both of these games combined. Look, I'm not here to drag these games into the mud. I'm just here to point out the positives and negatives so that people who might be interested in weigh them out themselves. The first game's main strength is its story, and the second being its gameplay. If Tango Gameworks has the ability to create a better gameplay experience, then they have the ability to create a sequel to these two and combine both the good story and the good gameplay into a game that could surpass the second by a mile. But with how the second game was critically acclaimed by both reviewers and general audience alike, I'm not sure if they'll follow through. Either way, Tango Gameworks has a lot to work on. Oh right, there's also the third DLC, The Executioner, where you play as the Keeper, controlled by a guy named Pedro Martin, where Mobius tasks him in finding his missing daughter, Marcia Martin.
No one cares about the Executioner.
Yeah, you're right.